Okay, welcome everybody to the third meeting of the Sensory Motor AI Journal Club and the first meeting of this RL debate series, where we explore alternative approaches to understanding agency and building agents that learn through action. And I guess without further ado, I'm going to ask Eli to give us maybe like a 1 or 2 minutes of spiel of his position. And we're going to go around the room for those of you, for the other contenders who are in the room. I'm going to ask you to do the same. And if you're not here, I'm going to try my best to summarize your position. Okay, let's start with Eli.
Hi, I'm Eli. So I coined the phrase originally, abolish the value function, after we read, I believe it was More Heat Than Light by Philip Mirovsky in our energetics reading group in grad school. Overall, I would just, you'll see in my presentation sort of what my real position is, and it's got some actual nuances to it. But overall, I coined the phrase because I just don't like this idea of saying, well, you optimize things and that's all you ever need to do. Optimize what would be my question. And what effect does that have on the physical world? How is the quantity being measured or optimized related to the physical world where the agent is embodied? Or really, I shouldn't say agent because I'm not thinking of computational agents. I'm thinking of actual living organisms, particularly vertebrates and particularly us.
Thanks, Eli. I guess another question I have for you. I mean, of course, yeah, that's a very catchy phrase and very revolutionary in tone. But if we abolish the value function, do you want to tell us maybe like one sentence or two? What are we going to replace it with?
I would say replace it with a more complete understanding of the brain and essentially just factoring our decision making and control problems apart from one another.
Good. That's it. Okay. All right. Niels, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Right. You want to go ahead?
Yeah. So hi everyone. My name's Nils. So I'm the research manager at the Thousand Brains project. We're working on kind of trying to develop sensory motor AI based on theories of the neocortex. If you've heard of Jeff Hawkins and the Thousand Brains theory before, that was associated with Numenta. We're kind of a spin out from Numenta now. That's independent. And so I'd say our kind of position on this is we're really interested in how sensory motor learning can happen, and without necessarily needing to rely much on explicit rewards. So we're really kind of focused more on sort of the unsupervised, you could say, stage of learning. But then the question is, how do you actually get a sensory motor system to learn effectively in that setting? And so a lot of what we're looking at, you can think of a little bit like Tolman's rats, where it's kind of like you just have a system interacting with the world, and it needs to efficiently learn in that setting. And the kind of things that we think are really important for that are actually sensory motor learning. So the fact that a system is kind of constantly moving its sensors and has a sense of what that movement is, and then using structured representations, this kind of term reference frames that we sometimes use. And that learning is actually taking place with kind of local associative learning, essentially Hebbian learning, and not relying on backpropagation. And that if you kind of combine these appropriately, then hopefully you get a system that can actually learn quickly and robustly, and address some of the kind of current issues with things like deep reinforcement learning.
Thanks. I guess, yeah, I mean, you mentioned Tolman's rats, and I think that's his rats and his experiments provided one of the biggest empirical evidence against the notion of like, every learning is just reward driven. And that kind of shows us we either have to augment or completely replace RL as our theory of interactive learning. But is that how you position yourself? Are you trying to replace RL or are you trying to augment it? Like, how should you think about your position there?
Right. I think, yeah, I would say it's more augmenting that reinforcement learning is clearly, important in the brain and has a role to play. But it's, I think, focusing too much on it just tries to push kind of too much into its responsibility, and then it just makes it harder, I think, to kind of conceptualize how learning can happen without it. So we're actually not kind of focused on introducing reinforcement learning at this point into our system, but it is definitely something that could be kind of accommodated. I also realized I should say about the 1,000 brains in your brain, what that's referring to. So in as kind of Mountcastle described it, is a sensory motor system that's kind of semi-independent from other cortical columns, and that they can work together and kind of build kind of a more complex system through their interactions. But each one can actually kind of learn about and recognize things like a whole object. And so the idea is that each one, and also kind of projects motor outputs and all this. So each one's kind of like what you would traditionally think of as a brain, but you have hundreds of thousands of these in your brain. So that's what the 1,000 brains in your brain refers to.
Okay, thanks, Niels. Let's move on to Adam. Are you the audience, Adam?
Yeah, so thanks, Hadi, for inviting me. I guess I haven't made the talk yet, but I'll maybe give some highlights. So first, I appreciate Hadi's provocative phrasing here. I'm not sure I'd actually defend the claim reward is enough. There's, as Neil said, a lot of other things going on in the brain, but I would say that reward is important, and it's I think particularly important for understanding one system in the brain, the dopamine system in the basal ganglia, and that's what I think is really doing RL. And there's lots of other parts of the brain that are doing lots of other kinds of learning, and I think it's okay to have multiple circuits using multiple strategies. But I do think that this reinforcement is important. So in particular, I think the position that I want to defend is a few things. So first, the cortex gives us lots of good state representations on which to do reinforcement learning. Maybe they're getting these through unsupervised learning. Maybe some of these are hardwired, but this allows the RL machinery in the brain to be a lot more efficient than otherwise would be. I also want to make very clear to people who are maybe coming less from an ML background that the reason, one reason that we like these kinds of temporal difference-based algorithms when thinking about the brain is because these are not just something that we thought up to model our neural data or to fit these nice toy models to classical conditioning experiments. Instead, this is an extremely powerful and general purpose algorithm that achieves state-of-the-art performance in a huge variety of domains. And so I think we forsake that computational power at our peril. And I think the last thing that I'll want to touch on is a lot of people I think make the mistake of assuming that RL is equivalent to Q learning, by which I mean learning a value over different discrete actions. This is just one species of RL algorithm. And in general, the thing that I think has better support in the brain is a different class of algorithms known as actor-critic algorithms, where action values themselves are never explicitly represented. Instead, we just learn probability distributions over actions conditional on states. And it turns out that something that sort of falls out of the math, and that there's also a lot of good neuroscientific evidence behind, is that learning a state value function is a very convenient sort of intermediate computational representation to have in order to make these algorithms more efficient. So if that didn't make sense to you now, hopefully it will make sense when I go over it at greater length.
Thanks, Adam. Just to clarify, so since you clarified that you don't think reward is enough, so can you classify your position as like, okay, RL is pretty strong, but it needs some sort of augmentation. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so I think RL, like in ML settings, we can generally, or in many cases, we can just do end-to-end reinforcement learning. This requires lots of compute, and this requires backpropagation, neither of which the brain necessarily has access to. The reason for all this in the ML setting is that, that's what allows you ultimately to learn good state representations. I think RL in the brain is perhaps it sort of tweaking those state representations somewhat, but is largely not responsible for that. That would require you to like backpropagate through a bunch of things that we don't know how that would happen. Instead, I think that other systems in the brain learn the features of the world that are useful. And then RL is really important for actually guiding behavior in pursuit of, sort of in the direction of actions that will obtain rewards, given those useful facts about the world that brain has learned. And just to answer Michelle's question in that chat, the review from Yale and Niv that I think is the main reading, or it's the supplemental reading for my talk, I think does a really good job of explaining this. It's sort of like motivated from the perspective of we should get rid of value functions, but at the end it says, oh, by the way, you don't actually have to do this at all, because it turns out there's this like really useful computational framework that incorporates both policy gradient and a state value function. And to me, this is, at least for me, this is the paradigm through which I interpret a lot of work in basal ganglia.
Great, thanks, Adam. Okay, next we have Anna Collins, who's a psychology professor at Berkeley. I think Anna couldn't make it today because she has a grant deadline, so I'm going to just try to summarize her work as faithfully as I can, and hopefully, it is accurate. So Anna argues that many behaviors are often attributed to reinforcement learning can instead be explained by working memory and other non-RL mechanisms. And her work shows that flexible human learning relies on online updating and internal representations rather than being driven solely by external reward signals. So I think her position is also kind of the centrist view that RL is pretty powerful and it is an essential component of interactive learning, but it's not everything. So you have to go beyond this sole focus on just some scalar reward maximization, a scalar reward that is given to you by the environment. Next up, we have Tom. Are you here, Tom?
I'm here.
All right, let's go.
Yeah, my name's Tom. I'm a computer scientist, and I'm primarily interested in the origin of value and the ability to make value judgments in high dimensions, like very context sensitive value judgments. And my position is that reinforcement learning and active inference too sort of struggle with this due to their underlying formalisms, the mathematical formalisms. And as a theorist, what I'm interested in is developing a theory called empowerment, where empowerment is a kind of controllability measure, and showing how empowerment, when you scale it up to very high dimensions, allows you to sort of flexibly make value judgments about new representations or knowledge or things like this. And it's sort of my position that the sort of optimization framework underpinning RL is sort of at odds with empowerment. And so what I do is develop new Bellman foundations for planning and intrinsic motivation that change the form of the Bellman equation to tackle some of these difficult problems.
Thanks, Tom. I guess we talked about this when you were visiting this summer. And one thing I like about your approach, or empowerment in general, is that it's a subjective property of the agent. It's not something that the environment gives you. And another thing is like the compositional nature and the fact that the math you developed ends up like you end up having these policies that are compositional and then they form a steady algebra. I want to mention this because we're at the Redwood Center and people love that kind of stuff here. So I think a lot of people here are going to enjoy that. So yeah, looking forward to everybody's presentations. And finally, after all of these presentations that will end in December, we're going to have a final synthesis debate session where we're going to pit these people against each other. And hopefully we'll have them fight a little bit because, usually debates, people just tend to agree a lot and it's boring. So I'm going to try my best to just make them say some spicy things. All right, that's it from me. I'm going to stop sharing now. And Eli, do you want to take it away?
Sure.
Actually, I have to make you a co-host probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
All right. So I'm here representing the position that we should just abolish the value function. So to really go over why, I'm first going to actually define what is this thing that I'm attacking so that, if I attack the quote unquote value function and you say that's not the real value function, then fine, I simply have to take that as a counterpoint. Then I'm going to talk about reasons to abolish the value function, the first section being, so to speak, empirical reasons grounded in neurobiology, then the sort of normative arguments about how we frame and pose computational problems. And then finally, I'm just going to talk about, well, what might be the alternatives to reward functions and value functions. Now, hopefully this first section should mostly be a review for people here, but let's go through it anyway. We'll establish some notation. You know, in reinforcement learning, we work with Markov decision processes. Here, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to be talking about fully observed Markov decision processes, but of course, partially observed also exist. So you're going to have sets S, A, and then, yeah, actually, you're just going to have sets S for state, A for actions, going to have probability distributions, and of course, real scalar numbers. So you'll have states and actions, some notion of an initial state, some kind of probabilistic or stochastic dynamics, which is a conditional probability density here. And then, of course, rewards as a function of states, state transitions, and actions. Right now, I'm going to assume either finite horizon or infinite horizon reinforcement learning. Most computational work is done with infinite horizon geometrically discounted rather than infinite horizon linearly discounted, like I'm talking about here, or hyperbolically discounted, it's also sometimes called. I'm working with, this setting because that's the one we have evidence for in the brain, and that's really sort of my object of study here. All right. So given some kind of policy, there's going to exist, sort of platonically, an infinite horizon reward rate for that policy, which, as we can see here, is just the result of taking a limit as we add up rewards over episodes of increasing length and divide by the number of time steps. Of course, these are expected rewards because the dynamics are stochastic, so we have to integrate over that distribution. Similarly, the policy is also assumed to be stochastic here, so we also have to integrate over that distribution. Now we're going to encounter our first value function, which is, the classic Q function for a state and action given a policy. The differential Q function is going to be, assume that we get a stochastic next state transition. Then we want to have the reward minus the reward rate, meaning the advantage of the action that we chose in this state. And then we're going to add the state action value of the next state that got sampled from the MDP. The state action value is simply the action value, the state value is simply the state action value integrated over possible actions. So over here on the right, we can just see a very simple state value function for a windy grid world. The idea being the agent starts at S here, wants to reach G, goal, but the dynamics will sometimes push them away from where they actually want, from where they were trying to go. So the actions would be move up, left, down, or right, then subject that to transition dynamics, which say if you try to move right, sometimes you might get pushed in another direction. And given a certain configuration of the windiness, we get this the state value function, where essentially at the goal, we've got the most reward we're going to get, which is 0. And at the start, we've got the least value we're going to get, in the sense that even under the optimal policy, it's going to take, what is this, it's going to take about 15 steps to reach from start state to goal state. So the agent here is receiving -1 for every time step where they're not at the goal state. Then receive a nice 0 at the goal state, and the episode terminates, allowing them to avoid accruing further costs. Okay, so we've stated what these equations are. Now let's give some intuition. Value in general in reinforcement learning is the recursive expectation of rewards. So you can have the value of a policy from the start state. That's just a state value for the starting state under that policy. We can have a Q value, which is the value of taking a particular action A in state S, followed, assuming that we follow the policy pi for the rest of time or the rest of the episode. And then finally, we can just have, the value of a given state, assuming that we are going to draw both the current action and all further actions from the policy pi. Ultimately, we set up these Bellman equations because what we want to do is solve them. And by dynamic programming or approximate dynamic programming, find pi star, the policy that maximizes value. So there are other names for this sort of thing. We're using the term reinforcement learning because that's what we would tend to say in at least artificial intelligence. In animal neuroscience, reinforcement learning is also often used to denote essentially a decision-making task or paradigm in which the animal is observed. I say observed because we might be observing behavior. We might also be, recording intracranially during their process of learning from reward and punishment, how to make decisions. Of course, the same formalism is used in stochastic optimal control, though they're often in continuous time. So those would be Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equations. And of course, this sort of normatively derives from economics, where we're talking about expected utility theory. All right, so if we've got ourselves on some kind of foundation about what the value function is, now we would want to know, why would you abolish it? So Markov decision processes model the task of sequential decision making. And we can confirm, this is just a known fact of, let's say, mathematical psychology for a long time, that, if you give people an MDP-like task in a lab setting, they will in fact behave as if solving the MDP, though often by a variety of means, not necessarily by solving the Bellman equation. Already, though, we're going to run into our first problem, which is that if we are using this to actually study behavior, then we don't have an identifiable model from an MDP. That is, given an MDP, then given an agent's behavior, and actually this statement is false as written, so I apologize. So let me nuance it. Given an MDP without a reward function, and then given an agent's behavior, we cannot identify what the actual reward function being optimized was. And this is something that I would tend to bring up because we know that when you give people a task, what they're actually optimizing is something internal to their own body, brain, mind, pick your level, desired level of abstraction. But they're optimizing something biological. They're not necessarily trying to maximize rewards in your task. So that's a little bit of skepticism about the psychology of it. And I would say if we want to really use this to understand the brain, in the sense that, algorithms in the brain are always operating, whether or not you give someone a specific laboratory task, then we need identifiable models.
So can you go back to the previous slide? I want to clarify, what exactly do you mean by identifiable? Does it mean, in the statistical sense, like if you have a generative model, you want to
Yes. Yes.
parameters of that. And it's degenerate, like there's many, many rewards that would result in the same behavior. That's what you're saying?
Not just, okay, so technically there are equivalence classes of rewards. Technically, there are equivalence classes of rewards that can result in identical optimal behavior. There's also the issue that if you don't know what algorithm is actually being used to make the decisions, essentially, if you allow yourself as many degrees of freedom as there are in studying a live animal, then you no longer enjoy identifiability.
Thanks.
So if you assume that you know the planning algorithm or the RL algorithm being used, then you can look at behavior and try to reason out which equivalence class of reward functions might be at work. If you don't know the planning algorithm, as we don't in the brain, and you also don't know the reward function a priori, then you can't actually identify either of them from behavior alone. That's the issue.
Thanks. Makes sense.
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand this as well, Eli. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically you're saying neuroscientists wanted to study this in the brain, and they're like, hey, this is some nice formalism for how optimal decisions might be made with a value function. Let's design a task that is an explicit Markov decision process, and let's make the animal do it. And so they set up this task. The animal has to make multiple decisions, and then they can measure the behavior. Given those two endpoints, the complete generative model of the decision process and the outcome of the behavior, there's many, many reward functions that could exist. Is that what you're saying? Fundamentally?
There aren't just many, many reward functions. There are many equivalence classes of infinitely many reward functions each.
Gotcha. Are you going to give why?
This is on the psychology end. So it's because we don't actually know the policy or the training algorithm in the brain a priori, nor do we know the reward function a priori. So then you don't have a well-posed statistical problem. Now, if we go what we're going to see in this next slide is that if we go intracranially, then we can start actually getting educated guesses. Things become a bit more well-posed when you actually look at the details of the biology rather than just black boxing off the behavior from the mechanisms that generate it.
Sorry to interrupt, Eli. So I just wanted to mention that in these meetings, we encourage discussion. So I'm going to ask people on Zoom to actually, you can, just unmute yourself and ask the question. Don't worry, don't put it in chat. We're not going to see those.
Could I raise my hand then?
Go ahead.
Because as I've been putting my questions in the chat, I'm with my friend Polkit, who's also here in the Theory Center at U Chicago. And I think we're a little confused. So just to make sure we're following. So because there's this degeneracy of reward functions just from behavior, we cannot infer a model. That's what that third data point is basically saying?
Yeah. So if you were given the reward function a priori and the behavior, you could make inferences about the planning and optimization algorithms at work. If you are given the planning and optimization algorithm and the behavior, you could make inferences about the reward function at work, up to affine transformation.
And are you claiming that the reward function is sufficient?
To generate the behavior?
Or to construct a model that, generates the behavior.
No, I mean, you always need. So if you're building a model, you always need some kind of, planning and optimization algorithm that is going to get you from a reward function, and particularly, from actual training episodes to a behaving, an agent that behaves approximately optimally. But I am saying, there are three things, and in natural experiments, we are given one of those things. We need at least two to even have a hope of identifying the other. All right, now, of course, the situation is not that entirely pessimistic because when we actually do intracranial experiments or examine, cognitive errors, etc., in detail, we can't actually look inside the black box and make guesses about the mechanisms generating behavior. So in premotor or frontal cortex, we actually find that people will tend to solve a lot of problems by planning as inference, particularly when they have to solve problems hierarchically by sub-goaling. In terms of motor control tasks, the brain seems to solve by ideomotor feedback control, which is something that we haven't actually fully cracked computationally yet. If we look at, the basal ganglia, and especially at the dopaminergic systems in the basal ganglia, there we see classical reinforcement learning, like really classical actor-critic distributional reinforcement learning, according to our latest experimental results. Then if we get all the way down to the peripheral reflex arcs in the spinal cord that move our muscles, we see something more like integral control. So overall, it doesn't look like the brain is sort of solving a unitary MDP. It looks like it's doing this very hierarchical, or let's call it, a mini branched tree of computational techniques being used to solve these problems at different levels of abstraction. All right, so then we might want to ask, well, sure, not every part of the brain is doing RL all the time, but that doesn't actually make RL a bad model of decision making. That just means that we're studying different cognitive faculties in different task contexts. So what would then be the philosophical arguments for abolishing the value function? So here's where we're going to get, let's say, a lot more contestable and only somewhat grounded in facts. So if we ask, what problem does RL solve? It's, dynamic programming for recursive stochastic optimization. Now, as I said, in my sort of little opening, 2-minute opening, what is being optimized? Reward here is often either an absurdly literal commitment to, say, for instance, the mouse maximizes the number of milliliters of sugar water that we give it to drink. Or in primate research, it's not actually sugar water, it's just water. We have them thirsty before they perform for recording. So are we really saying that there's an algorithm in the brain which is just going to maximize the amount of physical reward stuff we're giving to the animal? Well, on the philosophical end, that's not actually how Bellman invented dynamic programming. It's also not how computational reinforcement learning was necessarily invented. Often there was a commitment to, let's say, a shared commitment across fields between the people working more normatively and the people working more empirically, that reward ought to be this kind of substance. And I will note that on the normative or philosophical end, often there was an assumption that the substance was money.
Eli,
nothing.
Can I say this? Is this as simple as saying that basically reward is given by the environment? Is that the
Reward is given by the environment, and reward is a physical substance that can be accumulated.
Cool.
As in, think about money. There's nothing wrong with, as rewards in behavioral experiments, there's nothing wrong with money. But of course, in a natural environment, if you just pile something up indefinitely, Well, eventually it just gets ruined by the weather. So actually, we've already solved a bunch of control and decision-making problems by the time this substance metaphor is doing any work for us, because real-life substances can't just be accumulated or maximized in that way.
So I think I totally follow your criticism of reward as something that is given to you by the environment. That just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But, it doesn't have to be a physical substance, right? It can be something abstract, and it could be something that we collectively, socially agree is
High fives.
rewarding. Or H index. Imagine like you maximize your H index rather than learning something new or doing something impactful.
Okay, but do you think your brain actually evolved to maximize your H index?
I don't know, but maybe like that was Einstein's.
Like where is the H index neuron in your brain?
I don't know. I don't think that exists, but it's just I'm saying that the notion of environmental reward is I understand that criticism, but I'm just saying it doesn't have to be a substance, physical substance.
Yes.
H index is also a state. So is money.
Yeah. I mean, money can be non-physical. Yeah.
Is this
There's also, yes, go ahead.
is this kind of modeling task specific? Because I'm thinking about like in real life, we often just our decisions influenced by past experience. So it's not like memoryless. So I'm just wondering, is there any specific way you take into account this? And this very like especially some I don't know, evolutionary speaking, bad experience has a huge influence on our current decision making. So
I guess if I understand you correctly, there's the subjective element to decision making that your past subjective experiences impact the way you interact with the world and the way you perceive rewards in the world. And I think that's fundamentally what my first biggest issue with RL in this canonical form is like the reward is given to you by the environment. It just doesn't make any sense to me unless it's like specific.
And it seems even if you completely embraced this, there's a physical reward from the environment. You still have to have a mechanism for selecting between which reward you're currently optimizing.
Exactly.
Like today I'm optimizing. All right.
maybe I ask you a naive question. I'm just arguing whether Markov chain is able to characterize this kind of memory effect.
I think that's another problem that probably Tom might talk about because like his work involves like non-Markovian stuff. But yeah, I guess there's more than one issues with like the canonical RL formulation. But yeah, Eli, so do you agree with these sentiments about like, it doesn't have to be substance, but the main issues being like the subjective, nature?
So I would actually say that the substance problem becomes pretty acute once you're looking at doing continual reinforcement learning.
Mhm.
So if you're in an episodic context where you can reset the reward, or rather you can, tape off the end of the episode and then calculate regret or just returns over the whole episode, then fine, what it's a metaphor doesn't really matter.
Mhm.
On the other hand, if you're talking about an animal, which for instance, maybe it drinks water until satiation and then switches to doing something else because it's continually learning and continually acting, then the substance metaphor actually becomes quite important.
I still don't get it. Why? Why does it become important?
Well, let me tell you. So think about, your non-human primate or your mouse drinks water until it is satiated. Well, logically, if water was reward before, then water continues to be reward after satiation. So real reward optimization would just mean that you keep drinking water indefinitely. Now, of course, if we then say in RL, well, actually, the reward function is a function of the states and actions. So the internal state of the animal can be counted as part of the state. And then we'll say, actually, post-satiation, the reward accumulated from drinking more water goes down. Like, yeah, okay, fine. Now you've designed a reward function that doesn't really abide by the substance metaphor, but then you've also made the reward not really given by the environment, because now you're including the internal parts of the agent in your environment. So I'm saying that the metaphors are sort of baking in assumptions that are often not part of the math if we want to accurately model things. Now then, to actually get to my third bullet point, excuse me.
Can I ask a question before you or after? Go ahead.
How about after, actually?
Okay.
So on the final point of getting past metaphors and just doing mathematics, when we're actually optimizing something in reinforcement learning, what we're really optimizing actually is not reward, it's regret. So in episodic reinforcement learning, we can always compute the returns of an episode, compare to the best episode you've ever had, and then compute regret. And then you actually, you know, optimize your policy in order to minimize regret, which is equivalent in terms of an ensemble of episodes to maximizing reward. So again, in the episodic setting, that's equivalent to maximizing reward. But computationally, what we're actually doing is calculating either the Bellman loss or the regret, and then minimizing those. Well, I suppose there's like naive reinforced policy gradient methods, but those don't work so well, even if they do literally maximize returns. Okay, question.
Just keep talking for a while and then I'll see if there's more. I can come back to it later.
Okay. Yeah, so as a consequence of minimizing the Bellman loss or minimizing regret, RL is solving an open loop decision-making problem. Meaning, A, there's only the one time scale, which is that of state transitions. There is such a thing as hierarchical RL, but there's no agreed upon formalism for it. Well, I guess there's semi-Markov decision processes, but again, no agreed upon formalism. But then the important thing being that most of this relies on episodic assumptions. It relies on having an a priori given by the environment end of the episode after which Bellman loss and regret and their gradients can be computed, which means that you're going to wait until all the way past the end of the episode to actually get the teaching signal for your optimization algorithm. Arguably, one could say this is a consequence of using, for instance, gradient-based optimization rather than some other hypothetical method of deep RL that would work, continually and online. But as far as I can tell in the computational literature, there's very little on doing deep RL continually and online. There used to be some stuff in the message passing literature, and of course, that's not very deep. Like it doesn't admit rich representations the way deep neural networks are, so it fell out of fashion.
Eli, there's another question. Rosa, would you like to unmute and ask, or I can just read you a question?
Yeah, sorry. I put it in the chat because I wanted Eli to be able to get through his talk, and I thought maybe someone would answer it later.
We have time, don't worry.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering.
Oh, yes, that's completely correct.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. So real rewards in real animals are always ultimately dictated by the body-brain interface.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for interjecting that. Okay, so now we're going to ask what sorts of computational problems do brains solve in the motor control and decision-making domains? In the motor control domain, it's actually a much more closed-loop, feedback-driven, fully observable control process, meaning you have some kind of sensory signal. At the lowest level, it's just proprioception. You compare that to a top-down internally generated reference signal, which is counterfactual in the sense that actual proprioception always, ideally approximates the reference signal, but never exactly equals it. You're always minimizing those differences. And we can also note that there's a hierarchy of timescales with the dynamics of bodily movements and sensory signals there. Hopefully that's not too controversial with the neuroscientists in the room. Now let's get controversial. Okay, so if brains aren't just maximizing reward, then what problem do they solve during decision making? And there are strong reasons to believe that they are engaging in regulation of the body's internal physiology. As Peter Sterling puts it, anticipating needs and preparing to satisfy them before they arise. So this is continual predictive learning. You can't compute regret without actually segmenting behavior into episodes during which different policies were used. And maybe we'll hear about how the basal ganglia actually does something like that. Policies, however, are continually updated by motor feedback. So you can't use a value computation that is dependent on having a fixed policy throughout the entire episode. You need a value computation at minimum that allows for the integration of sensory feedback to stabilize behavior. And lastly, the various costs and rewards are functions of the internal state of the body, which is observed via interoception. So I took this figure from a paper where the mode of interoception considered is in the hypothalamus. So it's chemosensation. And arguably, that's a nice domain for studying interoception in, even if it's not fully general, because we know that there are certain neurons you can stimulate which will drive motivated survival behaviors. So when you really get down to the biology, what you're actually doing is sort of perturbing animals between these attractors in a state space that might indicate something like hunger states, thirst states, etc. And then once they are in this attractor, there is going to exist a high salience reward, a way of regulating their physiology that the animal will find rewarding.
Can I ask a question again?
Totally.
Yeah, so this makes sense for physiological needs on a pretty short time scale, but I'm not sure why we should think that it applies for longer term planning for like arbitrary goals.
So before we get to the other question, I think the question is whether the issue is, do we really think we have goals that are not biologically grounded in this way? And
I
I'm
mean,
just going to,
maybe all our goals are ultimately biologically grounded, but it seems like, on an immediate characterization, like my planning to get into grad school is not like this.
um,
Or
we'd
at
have
least
to
there
have
has to be some mechanism to couple the things that I need to do
yeah,
to get into grad school to various things that my body needs to do on a very short time scale.
yes, completely agreed. And I think that's actually worthy of its own entire talk,
Okay.
because you can look at evolutionary developmental neuroscience and find that mechanisms that are evolved for old and primitive reasons are always getting repurposed and exapted to do sort of more complex, more abstract tasks. And I've seen some strong arguments that sort of this kind of reward motivated behavior is one of those cases where, as you become able to support more complex behaviors, you also become able to support more abstract motivations.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
But yeah, it really is its own debate entirely. And now how about Michelle and colleague?
Hi. Yeah, I think what I was going to ask you kind of touched on. Like, even if this is the case, I don't think that this is necessarily an argument for it's the only thing the brain is doing. You could easily make the case that there's a different part of the brain doing more abstract goal-directed behavior, or things are being repurposed, like you're saying. Like just because this is happening in the brain doesn't mean that it's all that's happening in the brain. And I think there's really good biological evidence for that.
So actually, let me push you on that a little bit. Would you say there's really good biological evidence that the brain solves more abstract tasks than this, than just sort of food seeking and water seeking? Or would you say that there is evidence for where where the more abstract goals are actually encoded and how they are generated autonomously of anything more basely biological?
Yeah, I would say yes to both of those, and particularly for the second one. Like I'm in a monkey vision lab, and we actually see things like abstract category signals in the visual stream that are primarily understood as like oculomotor regions. And I would
Hmm.
argue that that is evidence that that there is incentive for the brain to encode even in pretty like even close to the periphery, like when in the visual system things that are very cognitive and very abstract, like unrelated to just like simple visual processing or like moving eyes. Like the sensory motor integration hubs also have abstract signal, and
Yeah, of course.
that feels like something else is going on. I don't know.
Well, I mean, so the cortex there is engaging in state representation based on sensory signals.
Yeah, but the fact that it's being encoded so close to the periphery makes me feel like then the brain is optimizing for abstract things, not just. So, I mean, I think you can make the case, like Rosa was saying, that like many abstract things can be reframed as being biologically grounded, but then it feels to me like a weird argument to say that like everything that the brain does has to do with like internal physiology.
I would say everything that the brain does is ultimately grounded in internal physiology, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's no abstraction.
I don't think anyone was claiming that.
Yeah,
It's
I
more
mean,
that
maybe this figure implies it accidentally.
yeah, and I think it's also that like it seems clear to me that there's like something about the environment that like biological systems are interacting with. So I feel like
Mhm.
abstraction of sensory input in this way seems unrelated to internal physiology. And like even if
Oh,
large parts of the
yes,
brain
yes.
are doing internal physiology, it seems to me that like there's plenty of evidence that there's other stuff happening in the brain. So it's just a bit of a like I think what you're saying here is true, but I don't think it's an argument for like this is what all of the brain does.
Oh, certainly not all of the brain. At the very, very least, there's a cortical versus subcortical separation that's quite strong, where cortex is, engaged in something like sensory motor generative modeling and maybe, some of that feedback control stuff using the generative model, and it can be quite abstract. This is more about what are the subcortical regions, what did the subcortical regions evolve for? And then there's, a higher level debate about which one actually controls the other in the long run, subcortex or cortex. Okay, George?
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to kind of check my interpretation of this. So thinking, for example, of water, is what you're saying that maybe we are not trying to maximize how much water we get, but instead minimizing the probability that we run out of the water we
Yes,
need.
exactly.
Mhm. So
Yes.
does that
So
require, like, is that kind of minimizing the probability of bad states or not?
um
And how will we
it
define those bad states?
so it is it is that the question is that we have to do a lot of detailed empirical work to find what does the brain actually detect or encode in sort of what data format. So with water or food, it's very nice because there are satiation signals explicitly encoded in hypothalamus. You can activate them and see that consumatory behavior just cuts off. there's actually also oversatiation signals, after which point, the perceived valence, the behavioral valence of the same stimulus will flip. So it's possible to hydrate an animal so much that further hydration, drinking further water becomes unpleasant and, avoided. So we know that there's at least a too little of this signal and also a too much of this signal. Now, abstractly, mathematically, we could talk about this as, minimizing the probability of these extreme values. The issue is that we actually can't talk about it as minimizing the distance from a set point, because when we look at the physiology, there is no set point. Instead, there's a range of settling points. Once you get inside, so to speak, once you get inside the range of physiological states that are neither too little nor too much, once you're inside that Goldilocks range, you're already at the attractor region and you don't gravitate towards some specific point within it.
There's one more question in the room.
Yeah, I'm Theo. I think we met briefly last time, I guess was it, I think it was this club. And I was curious to ask like what the interpretation is of like you kind of referred to like the attractors or settling kind of basin ideas from dynamics. And I'm a little bit confused as to I mean maybe it's just the figure is more loose than I was imagining, but like in this kind of visualization, there's this idea of that water and hunger and thirst or whatever are separate attractors that you settle into in some sort of like very high dimensional state space or whatever.
Yeah.
In general, these kind of like attractor dynamics type processes are not compositional in the way that I would assume I could. Hungry and thirsty. So how is that just like a qualm with the visualization, or is that a qualm with the actual description that you're referring to?
I'd say that's a qualm with the visualization. This visualization comes from a specific modeling paper that was essentially trying to capture the dynamics of when an animal will switch behaviors. So they're really talking about water-seeking versus food-seeking behaviors rather than hunger and thirst as internal states.
I see. Okay. And then another kind of less question, but it's just kind of like curiosity is like if other people see connections here to things like sliding mode control, where the idea is basically to drive yourself. You have some nonlinear dynamics, and then you're trying to drive yourself very as quickly as possible, not to a set point, but to basically a slice of the state space, which is much more kind of nicely behaved. It has linear dynamics, and you can kind of do what you want.
I'm going to have to look into that. Thank you for the reference.
I think we talked earlier also about kind of like that, kind of like you're trying to enable yourself by getting into a position in state space, which is like has more kind of like
possibilities in front of it.
To other spaces,
That's empowerment, no?
Yeah. So that's So me and Declan talk about that.
Well, I mean, Thomas is going to talk about that.
Yeah.
All right. So having got through the normative arguments for abolishing the value function, finally, with enough controversy, there's a question of, well, what else would you do? And I'm just going to suggest a couple of ways to refactor some of these control and decision problems, and then, give a couple of examples, perhaps biased by who I know. So one thing you can do to refactor sequential decision-making problems is to sort of unpick the Bellman equation. You can factor out the reward function R by using successor representations or successor measures. If you then use, linearly solvable control, as in Pinay and Daw, 2021, or path integral methods, as in my paper, you can disentangle your Bellman equation from the policy so that you effectively get off policy by default learning and can actually, allow for feedback control in your policy. My suggestion for unpicking reward functions, and we are about to talk about that some more, is to switch out reward functions that are assumed to remain stationary or constant through an entire episode for non-stationary energy functions over states, and then consider the derivatives or gradients of those states and their magnitudes. Similarly, for plain old motor control, this is really the area, I'd say, where we have the most evidence and the most model development. Assuming that you have a hierarchy of timescales in which the higher ones are slower and the lower ones are faster, then you can basically do, hierarchical referent configuration control, which is really like saying basically hierarchical PID control. And you can even, call that a kind of energy-based optimization if you really want to visualize its dynamics that way. But essentially,
if you call this energy, how is that different from Q function? It just looks the same to me.
A Q function is recursive prediction dependent upon a chosen action.
Mm-hmm.
So, an example energy function for something like PID would just be the squared error.
Yeah, that's right. There's no action here. There's only states and reward. So I'm trying to understand what is fundamentally different.
So R here actually means the reference rather than reward.
I didn't catch that.
Yeah, sorry. It's a lowercase bold r, meaning a vector.
Okay.
But yeah, what both decision-making and motor control have in common in real life is that you're doing some kind of feedback stabilized trajectory optimization. Now, talking about, metaphors and abolishing the value function, here's why I would say let's abolish the value function. The appropriate metaphor, in my opinion, is not substance, which you increase, it's distance, which you decrease. Meaning, ultimately, what we want is to minimize the distance between, the trajectory our system actually goes down, and some notion of an optimal trajectory. I say some notion because if we can't compute what that optimal trajectory is a priori, then we're trying to learn it and characterize it over time. And that's really the computational substance of reinforcement learning. But once we've learned something that tells us what the optimal trajectory is, we're just minimizing the distance from it by optimizing our policy. So we can consider, a goal state in an external environment, a reference configuration of the body, and then we can also talk about regularizing policies by minimizing the deviation from the system's passive dynamics. And then plugging computational neuroscience here, a common feature is that we're often, or rather always, dealing with local energy-based models. So there's always some energy function on local representations, which is perhaps parameterized by top-down and bottom-up inputs. But once you sort of have inputs from who's talking to you and your local representations, then you can compute the energy. Yes, question?
Thank you. I was just wondering I don't know if this is well formed, but what if you can't define a goal state ahead of time?
So ahead of time, meaning before the episode begins, or before the organism's life begins, or
Yeah, before the organism's life begins, let's just say that.
I think in this case the pithy reply might be the most accurate, which is tough luck, kid, that's life. None of us comes into being with a pre-programmed conception of an optimal state trajectory that tells us how we ought to live. Like I said, we get these like hints from, reward and punishment signals. At least for our biological grounding, we get hints for reward and punishment from reward and punishment signals that we can use to, compute and infer something about what the optimal trajectory might be, at least as it concerns, survival. If you then want to talk about, sort of like where would you get the higher level stuff or a higher level notion of optimality than that, then I would certainly agree that we're not born with it. Socialization can give us a lot of hints as well, but are those empirical data or are they just something someone made up? Please, that's a question for a philosophy department.
Is it fair to say that we also have to infer the goal state? And it's just another subjective thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you always have to in real organisms, we often have to infer the goal states and goal trajectories.
Mm-hmm.
And, one thing we could suggest or infer might be that's why we have brains. That's why we're not just feedback controllers. Okay,
Thank
and
you.
then finally, the other major computation involved in, sort of refactoring RL is these predictive world models that learn from actual experienced states to engage in long horizon prediction.
Can I ask a clarificatory question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, sorry, just when you say energy-based models, what are, I guess just that seems like a term of art.
Yes.
With generalized energy, it can be anything. Is it just whatever you're trying to minimize? What?
Generally, it's just something that you're trying to minimize and which is possibly subject to stochasticity.
Okay. But otherwise, like no constraints on the form or
very few constraints, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a term of art, like Jan LeCun talks about them. I know someone at Harvard who works on them pretty actively. Generally, they're considered very, very flexible ways of representing, just sort of a negative log probability surface, but non-normalized. So things which have more energy are less likely. Things which have lower energy are more likely, is typically how it's thought about. Again, there's a whole nother talk about like what can you do with energy-based models, but to sort of hint at when Tom is going to present, one of the nice things about them is that they are compositional.
Thank you.
All right. So, as an example of putting all these frameworks together, our friends at Verses have this nice paper out about, essentially learning to play some Atari games in mere minutes. They have an energy function, which is actually what they call the prior preferences over observations. Their actions are just game inputs, and they use variational Bayes for solving things. Alongside this sort of term of art here, expected free energy, it's one of the things that active inference people like. And then they essentially use that as the objective function inside of model predictive control to actually make decisions. Similarly, you can also, have what they call motor active inference, where you're doing almost exactly the same thing, except your energy function is now, something with a better parametric form over, specific body position sensors. And then your motor actions just, optimize the same objective as your learning and inference. So, abstracting away from the details, there's common problems which can have common solutions. Common problem in both neuroscience and sensory motor AI is that you would often phrase your computations in terms of these local energy functions and then sort of signal the values of variables to distant areas. The thing about energy functions is that you actually can't necessarily just do probabilistic inference with them because they don't have normalizing constants. One way to handle this as a solution might be generalized variational Bayes, like the last couple of presentations in this journal club were about. And then, you have the non-ergodicity of dynamics in control problems. That's really where I would say you can draw a divide between motor control and decision making. If you have ergodic dynamics, meaning that you can treat observed errors as just IID noise, then you are in the motor control domain. If you have to model their temporal structure in order to keep error low, then you're in the decision-making domain. Now, luckily, a lot of people also work on, representation learning for long horizon prediction making in the context of things like successor measures, successor representations. I think the latest paper is entitled Temporal Difference Flows, and that's from another team. This is all really actually blowing up quite a bit right now. So if you want something to research, you could sort of look into the references and get into this stuff now. And yeah, thank you for sticking with me through all this. We do have some references, but only 2 pages of them.
Thanks, Eli. So before we stop recording and start the Q&A section, is there any questions that you want to ask now before we go to that section? All right, I'm going to stop recording now.